this evening as we again take some slightly broader brushstrokes through these couple of chapters. I'm going to take the safe assumption that you feel the most relaxed at home. It'd be slightly uncomfortable if that's not the case, because it's partly the environment that you've crafted and created for your place that you live in. And there is something about, no matter how uncomfortable life might become at points, we can at least feel a measure of ability to relax and find comfort at home, even if it's simply the fact that the paint hasn't changed, and that our favourite chair is still our favourite chair, and that we know where everything is, and there's a sense of familiarity makes everything much more easy for us. It means that we can at least find some measure of rest and relaxation in the midst of everything going on, just because of that sheer familiarity with it. The Israelites, we need to remember at this particular point, it has gone past the point when they were going to be in forcible captivity. This is over at more than 70 years after they were taken into Babylon. In fact, it's about 100 years after that initial exile. And some of the Israelites, as we thought about last week, are still living in the land of Persia. Whilst the Israelites were in captivity, they began to, some of them, particularly men like Daniel, Nehemiah, Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they realised that though they were far from home, far from a place where God had given them and promised to his people, a place of blessing, a place of plenty, a place of nearness with God, they began to realise and practice that though they were far from home, they were still near to God. Why? Because God is not tied to a single place, but he is tied to his people. And where his people are, there God's peace, blessing and presence can still be known and felt, because God is interested in people, not buildings, for which we're very thankful, aren't we? When we go out of here on a Sunday evening, that's not our separation from God then begun for the week. God rather is with us. We know that and we enjoy it. There's a sense in which actually for us though, there is still a separation with God, though we know God's living in our hearts and we rejoice over that and the work of the Spirit in us and the evidence he does of him dwelling with us and working with us. But really we know that our home is heaven. We are in some senses still quite far from our home as we live here, and yet our experience is this, that we know God is with us now. And what we see in these couple of chapters is, and I hope you could see that as we read through it, as we're asking that question, where is God? We can see that there is something underpinning everything that Mordecai does, and everything that particularly Mordecai calls Esther to do, and in the end, something underpinning what Esther's realization is as she finally decides that she will go and see the king. There's something underpinning all of that. Because sometimes when we're faced with just doing the right thing, we don't have the desire to do it because we know it's going to be hard. But when there's the absolute conviction that it's the right thing to do before God, no matter how hard it is, we feel that we must do it, and indeed, hopefully, we know by the help and the strength of God, we indeed do it and get on with it. What we find here in this passage, I think, is that God feels still near to them, though there is trouble. And often that could be the case for you and I, can't it? When are the moments where we felt closest to God? Well, hopefully we get a sense of that when we spend time together on Sundays and when we spend time reading our Bible and praying. But sometimes we feel that God is closest to us when we're going through trouble and we're looking to him more consciously for help. We can also feel that when we're going through times of joy as well. When we're particularly conscious of his blessing. Because we have every spiritual reason to feel comfortable with God at every point, at every time, in every situation, even the most pressured times of our lives. Why? Because God is with us, which is part of the reason why we sung that hymn just a moment ago. That Christ can be our hideaway at all and every point. And we see, I think, again through this passage, that there are just glimpses of how we can be aware of that practically for ourselves. Because as we know, God isn't explicitly spoken of in this book, which is part of the challenge of it for us this evening. But the first thing for us to consider is that we first find opposition. If you go and spend or talk time with a Jewish family during the time of the Feast of Purim that they still celebrate, we mentioned last week that when Mordecai is mentioned, the children are encouraged to cheer. Well, when you get to Haman, they're encouraged to boo. He's the baddie. He's almost this sort of pictured as this pantomime villain throughout the whole book as this story is retold and read each year. By the way, the Feast of Purim is coming up fairly shortly for those who are in the Jewish community. But we're told a little detail about Haman right at the start there of chapter 3. Having had the whole scene set out, having had the main heroes put in place with Mordecai and Esther, some of the cultural background and some of the mitigating circumstances that are going to have an influence on the way that they act, Haman is introduced, and he's introduced there in verse 1 as the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. In fact, actually, I don't know whether you noticed it, but again there in verse 10 of chapter 3, Haman is also referred to as the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. There's this important little detail that's thrown in here that the writer has done. It's possibly Mordecai, but we don't actually know. Because there is something that's being signposted as to where Haman comes from and the history of him. Now, if you just turn with me very briefly back to 1 Samuel, turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see why that particular phrase, Haman the Agagite, is something that stands out. Because actually there's been this long history of the people of Israel having a problem with this man and his ancestors. Have a look at 1 Samuel 15. You'll find it probably headed in your Bible something like the Lord rejects Saul as king. This is the first time that Saul is rejected by the Lord. It then intensifies later on when he brings an offering to God when he shouldn't have done. But this was the first sort of real test for Saul. Saul is told here in 1 Samuel 15 from verse 3, God says, "Go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels and donkeys." And the reason for that is that we see there in verse 2, God had said, "I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt." You can go and read about that later in Exodus chapter 17. The people of Israel escaped from Egypt. The Amalekites came and attacked them, and the Israelites ended up having to defend themselves, and they won. But the Lord said he was going to punish the Amalekites further. This was the time when this was supposed to take place. But look at what happens with Saul. 1 Samuel 15, verse 7. "Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag," right, Agag, "king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep, cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. They were unwilling to destroy completely. But everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed." God's command to Saul was, "You are going to be the means of my judgment on those who have done evil. You're going to be my means of bringing justice." And Saul said, "No, I'm not. Not fully. I'm going to do this my own way." And Haman is a descendant of King Agag here. Now, the failure of Saul to carry out justice in the right sense, the failure of Saul to obey God, is going to result here in the Lord's people being brought into a position of danger. But it's even stronger than that. If you turn back to Esther chapter 2, we're told this little detail about Mordecai. Have a look there, Esther chapter 2, verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Who else was a son of Kish? Saul. This is Mordecai. He is part of this. He is part of the line of Saul. He was part of the family of Saul. Here we have again another man in the same family having to deal with a king that should have been a man from a line that should have been dealt with in the past. There's a degree of irony in here. Now, as God is using one man to deal with the mess of one of his ancestors. There's a sense in which, by the way, when you get into the later chapters of this book, where the family line of Kish is almost being redeemed, as Mordecai finally deals with those whom the Lord has said should have been dealt with several years earlier by King Saul. But the point is this: Haman's opposition to the people here, the people of God in this passage, was not just of his own making. This is a man who was evil, a man whose ancestors had followed the pattern of evil, a man from a line of people who had always sought to oppose God and his people, a man who came and was the last in a long line of those who had been in opposition to everything that God had done. And that's not entirely surprising, is it? People who hate God and his people will always arise. And though it appears perhaps to be Haman presenting all the problems here in this passage, and he is the one that certainly throws everything at the people of Israel, the Jews here, it's not really Haman that's the problem, is it? We know that all opposition against God, where does it stem from? It stems from the devil, who hates to see God's people being protected, who hates to see their witness, who hates to see them experience any peace or any blessing. It's not surprising, is it, that we see time and time again through the pages of Scripture God's people being opposed by those who delight and enjoy evil things. And it isn't just Mordecai, is it, that's targeted? I mean, we'd expect it to be Mordecai after he refuses to bow to him, and Haman's pride has been poked. But there in verse 6, we're told that Haman seeks to destroy all of Mordecai's people. Now, the actions of one man are going to have seemingly consequences on all of them. We go, well, at least Mordecai and what he's doing, at least there's a sense of justice in Mordecai's actions. He's not bowing down and fawning over a man who would be viewed in some sort of senses as like a mini god. He's not glorifying the setting up of a human idol. But it does present us with a problem. Perhaps I think probably the surprising thing of all of this, again, is that when the edict goes out, we don't read the next few verses that all the people of the Jews get up and flee out of the province, flee out of the kingdom of Persia. Instead, they stay there. Why? Because their lives were heavily ingrained and influenced and part and parcel of everything. But I think probably we find what we need to remember is that there is something deeper in some of their thinking. Just look into chapter 4. There certainly was, I think, in Mordecai. In chapter 4, verse 14. Says this: if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will rise from another place. Mordecai is convinced, in spite of all of this, in spite of the opposition that they're being faced with, and the sheer weight of it, that there is going to be some form of deliverance. Now, he doesn't exactly specify what or how, but he is convinced that God's people will be delivered from the opposition that they face. Isn't that true for something that a principle that we're supposed to remember? As we look at sort of our culture and the time and age we're in, we're aware that there is opposition to the church. Does that mean that whenever we see laws being created or things being proposed in our country, that we go, it's okay, salvation's going to come. God will, will use a means, will use any means to overcome it. Well, that's not always the case, is it? Sometimes there are laws created that do hamper and hinder the church. Things that are created to destroy the church and cause problems for all of God's people, wherever they might be within a particular place. Instead, what this sort of teaches us is to look forwards to what God is ultimately going to do. Because it is true, isn't it, that there will be salvation for God's people. Maybe not necessarily in our lifetime. We don't know how perhaps persecution or other problems might arise for the church in this land. But we know that ultimately one day there will be a salvation. That the church is always going to have opposition. There's always going to be another generation that's going to rise up and going to seek to cause problems for the church, for those who truly know and love God. And it's not just nationally. We can see it in our workplaces, in our families. Opposition isn't something new to God's people. But instead, what do we need to do? We need to have in this mind the bigger picture of God's plan, that he will save his people. That's why when you read the book of Revelation, you read those last few chapters, they're wonderful, aren't they? As they remind us that one day God will fold everything up together and he will wipe the tears from our eyes. And he will bring to an end all evil, and his justice will be reigned and set supremely over all things. The picture that we actually have here, if you remember Ian's phrasings of how you view prophecies and passages in the Old Testament, we have a basic, better, best. The basic was that God's people were going to be rescued. They were going to have salvation immediately, and it's going to be received through Esther. The better is that the salvation we need to be thinking of is Jesus' death on the cross as he overcomes the evil one. And the best is going to be that final salvation when all opposition is removed for all time. God's people faced opposition, but they could do it knowing that there was something that God was going to do ultimately about it. It's the way we're supposed to view it, isn't it, too? Not be surprised by it, but see the bigger picture that God is drawing and working everything towards. And secondly, we have opposite. Some people would say that opposites attract, and I guess generally that's true with magnets. But that's not always the case, is it? There are some people who are very opposite to you and I, and if you were to spend time with them, or perhaps even if I was to spend time with people who are opposite to me, sometimes you can just push people further away, can't you? You just rub each other the wrong way. It doesn't always work. It's exactly actually what we see here in this passage. As Haman finds his opposition to Mordecai, he branches out, he extends it. His opposition gets even greater, doesn't it? Because he ends up opposing not just Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people. But what is fascinating is to see how Haman sets up the narrative to present it to the king to get his wishes across. Have a look there in verse 8. Haman says to the king, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." The first ploy he has here is to not really name who they are, but just say, yeah, there's just a certain group of people. I'm not going to tell you, you don't need to worry about where they come from. You just need to know there's a certain group of people. They're nameless in the presence of the king. In some ways, what does that mean? It means that Xerxes doesn't really know exactly who he's talking about. He's got no way of going and corroborating it. And the truth is, in the size of King Xerxes' empire, there were going to be people who were not happy with him. Now, that was inevitable. I mean, he didn't become the ruler of a vast empire simply because he was a really nice guy and everybody wanted to have treaties with him. There's going to be conflict. But it does also remind us that Xerxes, as we go through this story, he is either a very lazy man or he's incredibly trusting. Probably a combination of the two. Because he is so easily influenced, again, by those who speak to him and have a particular voice in his ear. But especially when Haman describes the people, he says not only there's just this certain people, but he says especially about them, their customs are different and they keep themselves separate. But do you remember, by this point, the people of Israel, those who were living in Susa there, they had been out of the land of Israel for about 100 years. And yet they had kept some measure of their distinctiveness as being the Lord's people. They hadn't forgotten the ways and the patterns and the laws and the rules that God had given that they loved and enjoyed to practice. They were distinct, so that they were easily going to be identified as a people, that as the edict was later going to go out for everybody to find and annihilate the Jews, people would know who they were. They did stand out. They were opposite to the culture that was seen around about them. Why? Because there is always a distinctive flavour to God's people. There is always supposed to be the sense in which God's people are easily identified. By conduct, by speech, by character, by engagement, whatever it might be. The influence that God has in us is going to mean that we are seen and known and understood to be not quite the same as other people. The trouble is, we don't always like that, do we? And we prefer to sort of blend in and feel that we're part and parcel with everybody else. And yet that can't be the case. Why? Well, we know in the New Testament we're called to be what? Holy people. Set apart for God. Distinctive. And we wonderfully see that the Jews, despite the length of time they'd been living in this land, still had something of that. And then we find him saying that about these particular people that they do not obey the king's laws. Well, that's sort of a half-truth, isn't it? It's certainly true with Mordecai, choosing not to bow down and pay homage to Haman, as we read there in verse 2. But were they known for being rebellious lawbreakers otherwise? No, were they those that were always being taken through the law courts because they were forever causing trouble? I don't think they were. If they were, the king would have noticed them long ago, and the people would have dealt with them probably by their own harsh laws during the time period anyway. But it's just another way in which Haman is not only trying to twist the king, but it's another way also in which he's aware that God's people living amongst them live by a different set of rules. That would be true to say, wouldn't it? They weren't going to be going and joining in, on the main with the worshipping of their gods in the different temples, offering sacrifices, indulging their own senses in the same way that other people of the age would have. They did sort of have their own laws that they would be seeking to apply, being God's people. He stood at the and Mordecai, especially through this passage, is seen then as standing out. But there is a sense, isn't there, as you look at Mordecai's actions, you go, was he just trying to provoke Haman? Now, would it really have done him any harm to just, give a slight bow of his head to Haman as he walked past, just for the sake of peace, just for the sake of ease? Or perhaps instead is Mordecai trying to show us that we should be at times deliberately provocative to those round about us so that everybody knows that we're Christians? Well, yes and no, I think is the answer to that one. Because there are times, aren't there, where as Christians, what we have to do in order to show that we're Christians is at times provocative to those round about us. I think we need to point out here that Mordecai isn't actually really doing anything other than he would do in private. Now, would he bow to another god? Would he bow to another leader? Would he? Because that is, we need to understand that is the way that culturally Haman would have been seen as like a mini god. No, Mordecai wasn't going to bow to anyone else other than the true and living God of heaven. He's not going to acknowledge Haman's sort of lauding sort of praise and delight within the land, within his own heart. He's going to visibly constrain himself because he can't engage and embrace Haman in the way that everybody round about him was doing so. Mordecai was simply being faithful to God at home and in public. And that's often, isn't it, where the conflict comes up for you and I. Now, it's very easy for us to keep quiet in our own homes, to not allow our our Christian practice to be seen publicly because we want things to ride more easily, more comfortably for us. But sometimes in a matter of conscience, there are things that we just cannot do. Because instead we're choosing to show our worship, our devotion and our love of Christ. It doesn't mean, though, by the way, that we do need to note Mordecai didn't go up and outside of Haman's house and put a load of posters up or have a T-shirt printed saying "Not my Prime Minister" or something like that. Now that'd have been really provocative, wouldn't it? But he does it in quite a humble way. The trouble comes is that everybody else picked it up on it and starts pointing it out deliberately to make it an issue. Actually, that's often the way that it works, isn't it? Now, when we look at culture at present, as Christians, do we go out of our way to make at times ourselves and the view that we hold really apparent? Well, not really. No, it's usually only when something really dramatic or drastic happens that the government are trying to seek to make bad laws that we then go and pick up placards and go and stand outside the Houses of Parliament or write a letter to the MP. Now, most of the time we don't go and sort of bashing people on the heads just because they have a view that's different from ours or because they take offence or exception to the way that we practice what it means to truly be a Christian. But it is often when the lid of our Christian practice is lifted and it is seen by those round about us that then conflict can arise. And the question comes, are we confident enough in the character of God and his goodness to be obedient in private and in public? Now, would we be ashamed if people saw us living consistently? Because look at how Mordecai describes his actions. We're told there in verse 4, chapter 3, day after day, people talked to him about why he refused to comply with Haman, and they told Haman, but Mordecai, we're told, Mordecai's behaviour would not be tolerated, and this last line of verse 4 is, for he had told them he was a Jew. What's he doing? He says, no, I'm not bowing to Mordecai because I'm a Jew. He's saying it is entirely consistent with my conduct, with my belief. I'm not bowing to him because I'm a Jew. He says it's all about because of my identity as belonging to God. Are we prepared to be able to do things in front of other people, in public, and say, I don't do that because I'm a Christian? He doesn't apologise for it, by the way. Just I can't do it. I'm a Christian. This is the way that if I was to do this, it would be inconsistent with me using the title Christian and assigning myself and appointing myself as someone who identifies under the living God. And you go, it's a really small things, but actually it is often, isn't it, the really small things that are the hardest for us to show that consistent Christian character in. For example, asking colleagues, friends, not to send us certain messages because they know that they're unhelpful. Or not joining in with bad humour in the workplace. Not clocking off work early just because maybe everybody else does it. Not that I think that you guys are guilty of doing that particularly, but it's one of those, it's just those little things, isn't it, that talk about that consistent, steadfast character that shows that we identify with God. Instead, rather, what we find is Haman displays the world's attitude. If you don't celebrate me, then you are opposed to me. Well, actually, there are things, aren't there, that we can't celebrate. Things that we do stand against. Things that we do. Perhaps we do it quietly. Maybe we do it gently. Hopefully we do it graciously. But we are supposed to be opposite to the world round about us, and that is supposed to be understood. Why? Because when we do so, it brings honour to the Lord. And then thirdly, finally, we have options. Options. Once Haman's hand and plan are fully revealed, I mean, he really twists the king, doesn't he? And he turns up with this plan, and he says to the king, I'll pay you a load of money if you do exactly what I say. Well, the king remarkably says there in verse 11, keep the money, I don't care about it, but you can do with the people as you please. And it's worth noting at the end of chapter 3, verse 15, we're told that the city of Susa was bewildered. It didn't make sense. Sometimes as Christians we can fall into the thinking that everybody is against us. That's not always the truth. It's true. There are people who aren't Christians who are outright against the church and will seek to do whatever they can to damage it. But sometimes, as we know, we have friends and family and other and colleagues who we can get along with. They're not in outright opposition to the church. And sometimes the church has found that in the face of opposition, support, comfort, and help can come from unlikely places over the last several years. We've seen at times different people who aren't Christians, who we wouldn't expect to be sympathetic with a Christian attitude at all, working in support with Christians to go against various laws that have been proposed by governments. Why? Because the injustice is seen and it is not enjoyed or delighted by everybody. Again, it's just another facet of showing how Xerxes was a man so out of touch with his people that he would allow a wicked law to be put into place. Then we end up with this incredible dialogue between Mordecai and Esther. It's a bit like, I guess, probably having their WhatsApp messages recorded for us as things have gone to and fro. And Mordecai, he can't reach Esther, so he sends a message in. The king didn't let anybody into his gates who's weeping or wailing or covered in sackcloth. I mean, you can understand a king not wanting everybody's bad news or being reminded perhaps of any problems that have been created in his country. But Esther doesn't immediately know what's going on. Mordecai makes her well aware of it. And what he's doing here is he's trying to use all the legal means available to him to reverse the problem. And he ends up putting this option to Esther. And Esther's options are this: go to the king and possibly face death, or don't go to the king and certainly face death. Those are the two realities that she finds herself in the presence of. Here again we see Mordecai, again just hinting towards it to Esther that there is something bigger going on. We've read it already, but there, verse 14 of chapter 4, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish, and who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Oh, I'm sure Esther was delighted. Oh yeah, wonderful. I really wish I wasn't put in this position for just a time as this. Now, of all the moments for Esther to be queen, this incredible law is created there. And you go, well, we can see that the hand of God in that. Now, here is a queen who is Jewish, who loves the Jewish people, who's going to want to protect her people, the Lord's people. We can see that there's an orchestrating of that, and yet we can understand that Esther's sort of a little reluctant to go and get involved and engaged in it. But as we know, nothing ever happens by accident, does it? These options that Esther faces are really, they're going to challenge her particular attitude and mindset, just like we find with ours. Because when we look at our lives, we are often faced with two options of how we view everything. Do we feel that we are the victim of circumstances beyond our control? Or do we trust that God has a plan for each moment? Do we feel that we're a victim of things beyond our control, or do we see that we can trust God for each and every moment? That's the sort of the meaning, I think, behind what Mordecai is putting to Esther here. Do you see what God is doing? Do you see that now is a moment to trust God? Now is a moment to grasp hold of Him and to count on Him and His faithfulness and His promises, to count on His goodness? Or Esther, are you going to just try and hide away and pretend that none of this is happening and hope that against all hopes that something might happen? Reminds us actually that wherever God has us at the moment, it is for such a time as this. Now, that might be very uncomfortable for some of us. And it certainly at times is remarkably puzzling for us to understand. But more than Esther's, God has you living in the right place at present. Your neighbours are your neighbours for a reason. And when you get delayed on the train station, there is a reason for it. When you get stuck in an M25 traffic jam, which is almost every time you go on the M25, there is a reason for it. When things upset us over the next course of a week, or when governments change, or when authorities cause problems, or when whatever happens, God uses those circumstances. They all serve God's purposes so that His goodness is always seen and understood. And the result is that as Esther ponders these two options, she ends up deciding that she will go and see the king. She ends up saying, doesn't she, there at the end of verse 16, "If I perish, I perish." She recognises that she can't avoid this moment, that this is something that God has been orchestrating, that His hand is in it, and that she has no other choice. She is convicted that it is entirely the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. But she's not going to do it on her own, is she? Verse 16, we find that she says to Mordecai, "Go and fast for me for 3 days." Fasting was synonymous with prayer. It's one of the very few times where you think, why didn't they just say fast and pray? It would have been so easy just to put those extra 2 words in and we'd go, oh yeah, wonderful, this is really easy to see in the whole book. They really were trusting God after all. We need to know it's just synonymous with that. She says, I'm going to do this, but it's going to be hard for me. I'm going to stand up for the Lord. I'm going to stand up for His people. I'm going to make it really clear that my priority is that I identify with and align myself under and am consistent with who I truly am, which is someone of God's people. She says, but I'm going to find it hard, so pray for me. Well, we all know times like that, don't we? I'm going to have to do something. It's really hard. I'm not looking forward to doing it. I'm struggling with processing it. I'm not anticipating any good outcome of this, but I know that this is something that the Lord has set before me to do. So pray for me. Do we ask people to pray for us when we find ourselves in those situations? When people do ask us to pray for them, do we pray for them? That's what we intend to do and take time with, particularly on Wednesday evening. Esther comes to the point of knowing that she is going to have to intercede for her people. She's going to have to be prepared to lay down herself in order to give her people freedom. And doesn't that just give us a little bit of a bigger picture looking towards the Lord Jesus? You know, Jesus in John chapter 17, he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays before the Father. He says, what? The time has come. The time had come for him to go to lay down his life, to be prepared to be humbled all the way down to death, to lay it down for the sake of his people, to rescue them. And Esther just gives us that little glimpse of Jesus here in this chapter. Jesus, who didn't shrink from doing exactly what he knew God had sent him to do. And that's what we want, isn't it? We want to know that sense in our lives at each different moment, that we don't that sense of doing what God is wanting us to do and calling us to do at any particular moment. And when we're convinced that God has something for us to do, be that within our work, within our home, when we have a conviction that something is right to do before God, what do we want? But the confidence and the strength not to shrink from doing it. But instead the help and the support, often of each other, but especially of our God too, as we seek to honour him. These couple of chapters just clearly illustrate before us again that we need to be prepared to stand out for God. In the right way, at the right time, with wisdom, but that we also need to be prepared to serve God in the way that he's called and set and according to his purposes at all times. And what we know as we see Esther doing it is actually she's given the strength to do it. And it's the same Jesus that we serve too, who will give us the strength to stand out, to be counted, and to be faithful